to Solving for the Undefined podcast. I'm your host, Johanna, founder of Miss Kuiper's Classroom, the place that equips teachers in creating a healthy math classroom where students can thrive, no matter their academic abilities. But it's not always about the numbers, and that's why I'm here, bringing you the formulas to solve your problems, math and otherwise, plus strategies on cultivating that necessary math mindset. And that's what you can count on. All right, hello and welcome. Today we have my sister, Esther, here on the podcast. A couple of weeks ago I had my mom, so it's kind of nice that I get to have my sister too. Hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Of course, I'm so excited. Will you tell us a little about who you are?
For sure. Well, for starters, I actually go by Miss Kuiper, which is kind of confusing. But you all can just call me Esther. I know.
I remember the first time I saw your email, misskuiper@gmail.com, and I was like, wait, what? And then I realized, I don't know why it didn't click in my brain that you were also Miss Kuiper. But, it's whatever.
It's okay. So yeah, I just finished my student teaching. So I have finished my 4 years of undergrad and my 5th year of credentialing. So I now have my preliminary credential in multiple subject teaching. So that means I'm all ready to teach elementary school. So I know it's a little bit different than maybe some of you are listening to Ms. Kuiper for her middle school advice, but I'm here with a little bit of a different perspective from the elementary point of view.
I think that's awesome, especially since elementary is where students come from. So knowing kind of their background and what is best for them, kind of leading them into middle school. How do you feel being all done with your schooling now? It's been, 5 years?
It is absolutely surreal. I think I've never experienced not having homework to do. And I know very soon I'm going to have grading to do. And so I will never really leave the homework life behind. But with this nice little vacation, it's very odd. But I am so ready to be in a classroom. I think student teaching just really whet my appetite for how it really prompted me to want to be in the classroom as fast as I can because I can't wait to love on students.
You're going to be an awesome teacher. I'm excited to see all the things that you get to do.
I'm really excited too. And not online anymore.
Yes, seriously. Tell me about it. Were you able to teach at all in the classroom or was it just all online for you?
All online. It's crazy. So I am very much looking forward to next year, but it's also a little nerve-wracking. So whenever I'm going to be listening to podcasts about classroom management.
Nice. Well, there's definitely a few episodes on that for sure.
Thank you.
All right. So specifically because this is a podcast geared towards people or teachers who teach math, what have you learned and implemented in making math accessible?
That's a great question. So I taught both 2nd grade and 4th grade in my student teaching, and a lot of the things were like the things to make math accessible were they cross over between both grades, and it's really about getting to know your students. I know you've talked about that. It's this huge thing. We have to know what our students already know, what they need, if they have IEPs, what ways do we need to make math accessible in that sense of like how we're going to present it, how we're going to assess them, and things like that. Is there anything we need to pre-teach for students who maybe they're English learners and they don't know all the vocabulary or academic language? So it's a lot of making sure students are prepared to learn what I'm about to teach. So understanding where they're at will help me build a lesson based on that. And oh my goodness, there's so many things that go into making a lesson accessible, making math accessible to students. It starts with knowing where they're at, though. And I think some of the biggest things to keep in mind is really that academic language, and you have an amazing podcast on that that people can listen to. Understanding what to pre-teach, making sure you include times to actually teach vocabulary, as well as defining anything as you go along, so that students who maybe don't know the vocabulary that pertains to math, or maybe that they don't know the academic language, such as simple words to us like solve and total, maybe they need some help to understand that. So just while we're talking, incorporating that of, okay, kids, now we're looking for the total. Remember, that means we're putting all of it together, and having them understand the words that we're using that we think are so simple. And then the other thing I would really keep in mind is, we call it in my program having a low floor, high ceiling. Have you ever heard that before?
I've heard you mention it, but I don't think I remember what it means.
Yeah, so it's we use it a little bit more in ELA, for elementary, but it transfers just the same as making sure we ask questions that have a low floor but a high ceiling. So really giving that opportunity for a range of abilities in the classroom. So asking a question that is really open-ended. So not yes or no questions, not the students can nod because they aren't paying attention, but no, you asked a question, right? But a question that actually gets them to think. And it allows them to say what they do know without expressing what they don't know. And then the students who are ready to be challenged are given the opportunity to really reach for the sky and answer the question the way they need to.
I just tearing up a little over here. Not even joking. It's just so cool to see. Like, obviously, I'm your sister, so it's a little different, but just to see how much you've grown up since, like, you were a little kid. That's probably embarrassing to say on the podcast. Lots of people are going to hear, but just hearing you talk so knowledgeably about how to reach students and just knowing that the way that you're implementing these strategies, it's going to be amazing for these students who have you. And yeah, okay, I gotta move on before I actually start crying.
Thank you.
Okay, I loved what you were saying about academic vocab and how when you come across those, specifically teaching it, but then in your day-to-day lesson, when you say the academic vocab word, following it up with, now remember, that means this. So saying the academic vocab word and then immediately following it up by its definition or how to make it relevant. Because along with what you said, some of the academic vocab words have multiple meanings. So in math, it means one thing. In other ways, it means another, like product. So product in a math sense is the answer to a multiplication product. Multiplication problem. But a product in real life is just like, I go to the store and buy a product. So I like how you do that.
And it's also cool because you can relate those two things to the students and they'll see how it connects. Like, where have you heard the word product before? Like when you're first teaching that sort of word and like, oh, I don't know, maybe when the store is selling something, I'm going to go buy a product. Is that the same as produce? Like when I go buy vegetables? And maybe they'll start to put it together that it's the result of something being made.
That's awesome. So with this academic vocab and you teaching the math and making it accessible, how does that look like when you're planning a lesson? How do you incorporate that?
Well, there are lots of different ways to do it. I've studied a lot about how to make individual lessons about academic language. I'm not sure if that's more of an elementary thing when you're talking about, there's different, I don't know if you've heard of the tiers of academic language, but you're thinking about the academic language that's more general, that transfers across different subjects, and that's really important for elementary teachers to consider, such as what does evaluate mean? What does analyze mean? What does solve mean? More of those verbs, those action verbs. So you can create specific lessons for the academic language. And if you've heard, I think it's called the Freyer model. No, the Fryer and Frey. I forget what it's called. We should probably look that up. And they have lots of different models to engage students in actually learning the specific vocabulary. But I also just, when I'm planning a lesson, I usually comb through what I'm teaching. And I am a person who scripts my lessons most of the time. So I'm writing exactly what I'm going to say, especially when it's at the important parts, when I have to say it correctly, or else students will get confused. I have to explain the connections or prompt them so they can get the connections. I'm going to write in like explaining a specific word that I'm using. If it's a word they haven't used before, I'm going to take more time on it. And if it's a word they have used before, or at least most students should have learned before, which they don't learn in one lesson anyway, so you're going to have to spiral it anyway, then I'm writing in exactly what I'm going to say to explain it, or including a visual to show them what I mean. Which also, that brings me to another point. Anchor charts are amazing because you can teach them academic language when you're doing an anchor chart, which I don't know if you've talked about that, but it's basically what you do in the beginning of a unit that you refer back to throughout the unit, and it has all the main concepts on it. It's usually presented in a visually appealing manner for the students to remember, and using that will help students if you refer to it throughout the lesson, like, oh, and remember, this is multiplication. Remember the picture that we used? Or like, this is what addition is. Sorry, I'm elementary, but maybe exponents, something like that, and helping them visually remember what it is so they have that, especially for English learners and special needs students, they need that visual prompting to help their memory be activated, their background knowledge.
Yeah, I love visuals. I don't think anchor charts, at least for my classroom, I haven't been able to use them the same way as I know elementary school teachers do, but it doesn't mean I don't want to implement them. So maybe we'll have to brainstorm some ways that middle school teachers can use them. And maybe I'm just the only one that's not in on this game yet.
No, that's okay. Honestly, I use Pinterest most of the time for them. They have lots of ideas on there. So
that's smart.
one important reason we're teaching academic language to students is because we want them to talk like mathematicians. And one reason we need them to talk like mathematicians is because they're going to be collaborating with each other. And why? Because we need to be doing explorative lessons with them, engaging lessons with them, where they're working with one another. And if they are using language from all over the board or using the word product wrong, right, they're not going to be communicating with one another. And so we don't just teach academic language so they know the words that are coming out of our mouths, but because they need to start using that language so that they can communicate with each other in collaboration. And collaboration is a huge part of explorative lessons in math.
And I think that ties in really well with, I don't know if you listened to the episode that just came out on Monday, but my friend Mona was talking about how our students need to learn how to be mathematicians because there's no such thing as a math brain. There's nothing genetically specific in our brains that wire us to be good at math. It's about our experiences, our growth mindset, the high expectations our teachers provide for us, and the way our teachers teach math. That's an important part of it. And growing that math identity is going to be directly playing into how we feel as mathematicians, because when you do math, you're a mathematician.
Mm-hmm.
And adding that academic vocab in and talking to each other like mathematicians is going to be a great way to help shift our entire culture in understanding that math is not the bad guy people think it is.
Mm-hmm. And it helps students feel that success because they realize that they're using these big words that they didn't learn, that they didn't know a year ago, right? And so now all of a sudden they're being able to communicate with people, with their peers about mathematics in a way that makes them successful. And that's just going to boost their confidence and allow them to have that growth mindset like, wow, I learned this and I'm able to I can keep learning this. And I can keep collaborating with one another and growing my brain.
Yeah, exactly. And so how does this explorative learning go into other pieces of your lesson? Like, is this your entire thing? Do you set it up? Talk us through your process.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different opinions out there on explorative lessons. And I've definitely wrestled with that as a student teacher, reading different books about the different opinions on it. I think my take on it is that exploration can be taken really two ways. It can be used to prime learning. So, like before you're going to teach a new concept, you want to have them explore first. Or it can be done after you teach a concept where you want them to apply it to the real world or have them be challenged to learn the next step. So, for an example, for me, it was second grade. So I know it doesn't quite relate, but I did exploration when I was teaching money because it didn't make sense for me just to go straight into teaching the students that a penny is 1 cent. And now let's add the 1 cent. The nickel is 5 cents. Now let's add the 5 cents. Now let's add 5 cents and 1 cent. I took time to have them explore the coins, right? I wanted them to get familiar with what the coins looked like, especially the students kept putting up, is this a nickel? And yeah, it's very clearly a quarter, right? On the camera for me, right? And so I have to sit there and be like, okay, let's explore it. Does it have George Washington on it? Yes, it does. That means that's not a nickel, that's a quarter. And so it's using that. You heard my teacher voice, huh? That's how exploration will prime them for learning the next thing. Is if they're already familiar with the facets of something, they're going to be able to understand how things connect, so that when we teach something directly, they'll know maybe some of the language, they'll know different facets of it, so that they will understand how it works together more. So that's my example on that one. I don't know if you have an example for 8th grade or middle school or anything like that.
Yeah, for explorative learning, one thing that we did, and I do think that I implemented it incorrectly when I did that, so take this with a grain of salt. But our next step was Pythagorean theorem. And I wanted the students to explore the difference between a right triangle, obtuse triangle, and acute triangle and how the formula worked. I think this would have been better after I taught the Pythagorean theorem of showing like why does it only work with a right triangle, not before. But I was a first year teacher, so, that's when you learn. So the activity itself was students were given the side lengths for each of the sides of the triangle. And their job was to explore why does it work with the right triangle, but not the other two. And they were putting the pieces together of figuring out like, oh, it's because when I square this side and this side, it doesn't equal the squared of this side. I think that would tie in pretty well with explorative learning, would you say?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you really touched on an important thing of when to teach it, which I was just talking about, because I had that same problem. I was using a curriculum when I taught fourth grade that was an explorative model. And I really struggled with it, especially for my students that were below grade level, because they didn't have the base knowledge necessary to be able to explore anything. I was using words they didn't know, and I'd have to backtrack and try to explain it to them. And then they would sit there and stare at me because they had no idea what I was talking about. So it's really important to give them that base knowledge. And it all ties back, right, to knowing your students. You have to know where they're at. And your students are going to be different. So there's some students you might need to take away in a small group and help them before you teach something else, because they're all going to be on different pages. But that's why we need to give them those basic building blocks before we have them explore. And so that's, if you want to do an engage lesson or an explore lesson before you teach something, you still need to know that they have the base knowledge necessary to do that. Or you can do it a direct instruction lesson, and then at the end of that lesson or in a next lesson, have them explore something with it.
I like that. And I think the direct instruction and then the explorative lesson would have really worked for my students for the Pythagorean theorem thing, but definitely not explore beforehand. So with explore lessons, do you think that they are easy to set up, or does it take some experience in learning how to approach them?
It takes a lot of experience, and I, as a first year teacher, I can't give too much insight into how much experience. Let me see. I have a quote somewhere. Let me try to find it. So I mean, lesson planning as a student teacher, like I'm in the phase where I'm lesson planning everything, right? Because I can't do anything naturally. Well, that's not true. But most things I need to have on paper so that I'm not forgetting anything for the students. But I think explore lessons, you can't just have some questions and hope the students will figure it out. We have to know where we're taking them and with that end goal in mind, so we know how to lead them there. And then we need to have purposeful questions to get them there. And the quote I wanted to read is actually from Joe Bowler, which we all know and love. I know, my sister's excited. But here, I'll read it to you. When teachers are designers, creating and adapting tasks, they are the most powerful teachers they can be. Any teacher can do this. It does not require special training. It involves knowing about the qualities of positive math tasks and approaching tasks with the mindset to improve them. So instead of having lessons be boring, we're trying to improve them to make them accessible to students by making them relevant, by making them concept-based, by making them visual and hands-on to prime them for learning and to set them up for putting pieces together so that they're ready to learn things like the Pythagorean theorem, or they've learned it and now they're putting it together in their brain with a visual so that they remember and go, oh my goodness, that's why that works. I'm not going to forget that anymore. But it does take that planning on a teacher's part, especially with actual things like manipulatives, that word was hard, because that takes actual prep time. It's not just I can ask a question and the students now talk about it. I actually have to create things for the students, and that takes a lot of time. But I think one thing we often jib our students on is our questions. We really need to be asking questions that are purposeful for our students, and helping them feel prepared with the base knowledge to answer the question so that they're not floundering and sitting there like, I don't know what this means. So I guess it really comes down to what scaffolding, right? We're asking questions in a purposeful manner that is timed correctly. We're asking them in a sequential manner to get students where they need to be so they get to that end idea.
Yeah, and that goes back to that, what was it, low floor, high ceiling? Did I say that right?
Yes.
So those types of questions, having him, I like what you said, they have that base knowledge, but it allows them to explore further and think deeper on the concept and be like, oh my goodness, that's why it works.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, like when we're teaching math, it's less about a checklist of things that they're learning and way more about the concepts anyway, which is what I forget they're called, math practices. What are they called?
Math practices.
Math practices, they're much more general. They're all about ways of thinking, right? And even the Common Core standards are a lot more concept-based, those ways of thinking. And allowing that time for exploration and collaboration is really developing their way of thinking. They're working with one another to learn from one another, like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. How did you do that? Can you show me? As well as, oh my goodness, I thought about it this way and it totally worked. And so we're really having them start to think like mathematicians, not in a sense of I can now do an algebraic equations that makes me a mathematician, because real mathematicians are people who discover. They're people who are going to be thinking about art and concepts and exploring new things. And we really want to, I say really a lot, but I do really want the students to develop a mathematical mindset, but not in the sense that, as you talked about, a lot of the world thinks about it like, oh, it's boring, I don't have a math brain, but in the sense of I can do this because I can teach my brain to think a certain way and think conceptually to wrap my brain around this new thing.
So cool. So when you said stuff about students learning it from other students and like, oh, I didn't think about it that way, that is such an amazing strategy to use inside of a classroom, because I think a lot of people have the misconception, and especially people in the older generations who are taught math a very specific and structured way. Like, you have to do the long division method, or you have to multiply this way. And we've come a long way in the math world, like creating visuals and the area model and other different ways of thinking, because that works for some people. The old methods still work for other people. But again, it goes back to knowing your students, what is going to be helpful for them. That collaboration piece, when students work with each other, because there are different ways to come to the same conclusion, there are different ways of thinking, but we all want them to lead to the same conclusion. So no matter what road you take, we want it to come to the same conclusion. And because everyone's mathematical brains are in different stages of growing, it's going to be a different path. Collaboration is an amazing part of a classroom.
Yeah, and that's inherently a low floor, high ceiling approach because students can work together and use their different background knowledges together. And so that a student who might not be up to grade level can still contribute what they do know while using what the other students know to take it to take another step in their learning. Whereas the students who are already maybe at grade level or above grade level can start to piece together different ways of thinking about it. So their learning is not necessarily like, oh, like I'm learning how to do the equation now. It's let me start to think about this a different way, and that challenges their brain. And another thought I had is, I know this is not a podcast on diversity, but collaboration is a super important thing to do in a classroom because students start to respect one another. Because there are different ways of thinking about different mathematical ideas, a student who thinks that they own the classroom could look at a student who maybe is not so popular and go, wow, that was a really amazing way that you just thought about that, and you totally arrived at the correct conclusion. I never would have thought about that. And it wasn't a traditional way to think about it, but how creative. And I know that maybe is the best case scenario, but that whole idea of working together really allows students to see how their different brains work and know that everybody contributes something to the classroom.
Thank you for sharing that. Just because it's not a podcast on diversity doesn't mean it doesn't have a place in a math classroom. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I have a question. It's not necessarily particularly related, but so because you're fresh out of college and you have these amazing ideas that some people who are even just a few years into teaching probably forgot, what is something that you would want to share with them that you think is super important from what you've learned recently?
Okay, I definitely have something to say. So while student teaching, I got caught up a lot in the curriculum. And I'm not sure if that's more of an elementary school problem or not, but it really confined me and some other student teachers of what we're doing. And so we focused a lot on transfer of knowledge. And I think if I could stress anything, I know I'm a newbie, so I don't really know if I have a position to tell you anything, but that's something that I can't wait to incorporate in my classroom is transfer. And that means that when we're teaching things, it's not isolated and it's not meant to stay in a classroom. We want to have a purpose that's real world. And so when we're creating units, something my professors taught me is that we're not just creating learning goals that are, in your case, math related. We're also creating a learning goal that might be social. It might be a real world transfer thing. I can't think of a math one for right now, but an ELA one I would use is I want students to learn empathy through reading this book, right? That's a real life learning goal that I have, even though we're reading Because of Winn-Dixie. And so for math, it's really, so many people think it's so isolated and so boring, but we need to have that transfer in there. I know you all hunger for that and you want it, and that's why you love math. And we have to let the students see that. So there's this amazing she's a math teacher, I call her mathematician, called Miss Tolliver. Have you heard of her?
Mm-mm.
So I don't even know when the videos are posted. It's definitely from probably a decade or two ago, but she's absolutely amazing. And I will never forget the things that she did in making math transfer to their real world. She did it especially actually in homework. So homework was, I mean, people have different opinions, but she would have them take home things and apply the math to their real life. And one time she had the students go outside. They were learning angles, and they had to go outside, and she'd point to an angle, and they had to say what type of angle it was. And just understanding how that angle supports the structure. Why didn't they use this angle instead? This angle helped, the right angle helped keep the building have a better foundation, right? So starting to transfer those ideas to real life is super, super important, as we all know. But I would recommend starting to put that into your lesson planning. Why is this relevant? And then making sure you include some way to relate it to their real lives. And actually, I even take the time when I was teaching my fourth graders especially to tell them why it was relevant before I taught it to them. Like, this will help you because. And actually, when I taught graphing to my second graders, they stared at me in disbelief when I told them, like, you will use this for the rest of your life. They were like, no. And I was like, yes, you will use this in middle school, in college, and for the rest of your life. And so it primed them to want to learn it. And then I used real life examples while I was doing the graphing with them. Like, let's graph how many siblings you have. Let's graph how many slices of pizza you would eat so that we know how many to bring to the party. And having them start to think, how would I use this graph in my real life? Oh, I'm throwing a party. I need to figure out how many pizzas to bring. That was long-winded, but that idea of transfer, I think, is really important, especially for math, because of all the philosophy that you have about math.
Mm-hmm. And that's how you make math matter for students, is when you apply it to their real world, like telling second graders, you're going to use this graphing for the rest of your life, and making that math matter to them because, oh, I'm going to need this later in life. I got to learn it now. And allowing them to see how it's going to be useful for them, and not just saying like, oh, you're going to use it later, but literally showing them like, you're going to need this in high school. You're going to need this in college, and showing them why it's going to matter to them.
And if I could recommend another thing, I mean, it's easier for me as an elementary teacher, but it just shows me how important it is that even for teachers who are just teaching math, one of the ways to transfer is by having interdisciplinary lessons. I know it's a little bit hard because you all are on a schedule and pacing guides and all that, and I understand that. So as an elementary teacher, I can't say like, you have to do this, because I have more time to do that and more freedom. But one way to transfer is like bringing in science and how we use the math in science, because a lot of math that we use because of science, or we use because of statistics, and maybe bringing in those real examples from other studies, like social studies with demographics, or science with different experiments, so that they can actually apply what they're learning to a different subject in a way that might apply to their real life.
And therefore making them well-rounded humans, because they have those neuron connections between the different subjects. And especially if like they love language arts but they're still learning how to love math, if you have a math lesson that incorporates language arts, they're going to see the connection. They're going to be, the transfer of love is going to come to math, and they're going to see why math matters and how to connect it to the rest of the world.
Yes, exactly. Oh my goodness, I totally agree.
Awesome. All right, final question. A question I ask every single person who comes on my podcast. Technically, you're the third one, but every single person who's come on my podcast. What is your favorite math joke or pun?
Ooh. Okay, I don't know if you've already done this one. I think I've heard you say it in one of your podcasts before. But any case, my favorite one, and I used it with my fourth graders this year when we were teaching geometry, was, well, if you were a triangle, you'd be a cute triangle.
Yes!
And I was teaching them how acute angles make acute triangles and all that stuff. So that's probably my favorite.
That is the right one for you to choose. I won't be obtuse about it.
Oh my goodness.
I'll stop there. Awesome.
She'll continue later. It's okay.
I will. All right. Thank you again so much for sharing all of your wisdom. I know I learned a lot from just listening to you, especially since you have such an amazing brain, but because you're fresh out of college and fresh out of student teaching, you have a lot of knowledge to share, especially as an elementary teacher. You are where our students come from when they come to us in middle school. So I appreciate hearing how much you are doing for your students, and I know I will benefit from you in the long run.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all for listening to me, even though I don't have a ton of experience. But just know that I'm so excited to implement the things I am learning, and I continue to learn from all of you as well.
All right. Thank you so much for being on this podcast. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. To find all the links and resources to things talked about in this episode, head on over to MissKuipersClassroom.com and click on podcast.